All right, welcome and good evening, everybody. Welcome to Community Conversations, a panel series presented by Dorson Community Foundation. My name is Dakota Palicki. I'm the director of Talent Hubs at Civic Lab and the host of Lumina Foundation's podcast, Today's Students, Tomorrow's Talent. I have the pleasure of serving as your moderator for today's conversation, a conversation about mental health, the pandemic's impact on students of color. We're really glad you're here tonight. Thanks so much for joining us. We have a fantastic panel lined up for you today, but this evening is only going to be successful with your engagement. So please make comments, ask questions, and most importantly, make some connections through the chat and Q&A feature throughout our time together. We'll be sure to take some of your questions as we go along and save some others for a Q&A session later in the evening. Today's conversation comes at a critical time. As students of all ages return to school and college, many are facing mental health challenges. Too often, students and families face confusing systems of support, service gaps, and stigmas attached to seeking help. Communities and organizations around the country are asking themselves how they might work together to meet these challenges and ensure students have the supports they need to be successful. Together, we have a lot to learn from one another here in Essex County and from examples around the country. I'm delighted to share the stage today with local leaders and experts who go to work every day to make this goal a reality and to hear about the issues they see and the solutions that they've developed. And I hope you walk away with a clear understanding of how you can get involved in creating a stronger mental health support system here in Essex County. Our panelists today, I'm very excited again. We're joined by some great folks. First, Dr. Dion Bates, Senior Mental Health Advisor at the Black Emotional and Mental Health Collective. Based in Atlanta, Georgia, Dr. Bates oversees all clinical aspects of BEAM's curriculum and programs. She's an author, a licensed professional counselor, and has served many roles at Georgia Southern University's Counseling Center. Dr. Bates, thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Hello,
Stephanie Johnson is the Executive Director at Lee Thompson Young Foundation. Also based in Atlanta, Georgia, their mission is to eliminate the stigma related to mental illness through evidence-based mental health education and awareness programs. She also operates her own mental health coaching and counseling company that specializes in consultations and mental health professional matching. Dr. James Peterson is the superintendent of Essex County Schools of Technology. He started his career teaching in Jersey City before moving on to the East Orange School District. After holding several teaching and administrative positions, he now manages a district of over 2,000 students coming from Newark, Orange, East Orange, and Irvington. Dr. Peterson leads efforts to make sure all students have the support they need to be successful. And finally, our own Natasha Scott, Executive Director of the Dorson Community Foundation. Armed with her master's degree in higher and post-secondary education, Natasha has dedicated herself to providing students in Essex County with college prep programs and mentorship. Later on, we're going to hear about the efforts underway at Dorson focused on supporting students in our community. Thank you, panelists, for joining us today, sharing your knowledge and experience with our community. Conversations like this help us keep the fire of change alight, and I'm very grateful to have Dorson Community Foundation at the helm, leading the way. So before we get into our conversation, and speaking of Dorson, I want to invite my very good friend and colleague, Natasha Scott, to welcome us to today's conversation. Natasha, great to see you again.
Good to see you, Dakota. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining Dorson's third community conversation event. I always say you can be doing anything tonight, especially on this beautiful June day, but you chose to spend some more time on Zoom with us. So I'm super, super grateful to you guys for that. Dorson was founded by my mother, Sonia, back in 1992 with a mission to provide enrichment and opportunities for youth in the inner cities of Essex County, New Jersey. A community filled with young people with hopes and dreams and great potential, but often disparate opportunities due to systemic inequities. Today in 2021, Dorson maintains the same mission my mother set out nearly 30 years ago. And we are, through this community conversation series, leaning into a rather extraordinary time in history where the collective conscious is uniquely spotlighted on the lived experiences of low-income communities and communities of color. So through conversations focused on how to support these populations, we're hoping to build awareness through conversation and hoping to trigger action and change both in the system at large and in the very real lives of the students that we serve. So tonight, I, alongside our panelists, hope to shed some light on the impact the COVID-19 pandemic has had on our educational system's most vulnerable students, which are students of color, the same students we at Dorson predominantly serve, and many other community organizations have been fighting to empower and support through this challenging pandemic. So I really hope tonight's conversation will provide you with the knowledge and tools to continue self-education, to get involved in your local community, and to support organizations and institutions working on the ground to mitigate the challenges our communities are facing. I applaud you all for being here tonight, and I really hope this panel provides you with whatever insights you need to further this movement. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Natasha. And again, it's just been such a pleasure to be involved in the really great work that you and Dorsen and your team are leading. And, I want to just get us started with tonight's conversation, just bringing us right to home. And Dr. Peterson, if it's okay, I'm going to start with you. I'm a former public school teacher. I came from Chicago public schools, and, we kind of knew mental health services were a big challenge even before the pandemic, particularly for schools, K-12 schools. There are some estimates out there that a typical district on average only has one counselor per every 400 or so students. So I'm just hoping you can start us out tonight by bringing us into your own schools. What do these challenges look like now? And then how is your district preparing to handle the potentially increased demand for mental health services?
Well, thank you, Dakota. Thank you for also inviting me here tonight to speak. We've worked with the Dorsen Foundation before. We want to continue doing so, and we're very happy with what we've done. I think the first thing before the pandemic, if I could just start there, for the last 15 years or so, we've been talking about bullying and a lot of the other self-awareness. That's great. But when you start doing some things about self-awareness, children then start to understand and they start to self-evaluate. And then they know when they're hurting. And we've been telling them to articulate when they're hurting. So this was happening even before the pandemic. And it was almost the perfect storm, because at that point when we started to just touch on social emotional learning, touch on really understanding bullying and cyberbullying and really kind of getting underway, that's when I believe, I'll speak for my students, but I think students in general were much more aware of depression, body issues, sexual identity, all of these other things that were going on, and also social justice. This was all happening before the pandemic, where it was really coming. And then now, with that kind of support system that we had, which was the face-to-face in schools, was taken away from many children. We in our school district, we maintained it, but for that first, when we went out, I'll never forget the date, March 13th was our last day. After that, we were totally remote for the rest of that school year. So it was, hopefully I'm articulating this the right way, it was just almost the worst time really to have that happen, because just as the children were really aware of all of these things, then that face-to-face, having small groups and everything like that was gone. Before we went out, we had to do something. We had our school resource officers actually eating with students, and they called it the chat and chew, which just so that young people could start to interact with law enforcement in a very, what better way around food to really start talking about it. And then we had to go remote. So that was what we did. That's what was happening before. And then we had to really ramp it up in our school district. We did something with Wellness Wednesdays that occurred every Wednesday, so that the students had stuff like, they had workshops on growth mindset versus fixed mindset, how to manage their money, how to deal with stress, all of these different things, sometimes even a cooking class, all of these things. This is what we did during the pandemic to keep them in tune. And by the way, this was not my idea. This was the children's idea. These were the students. We tried to keep in contact with them and have very good relationships and open forums where I talked to my student council. We met frequently, and they said, we need something. We're hurting and we don't know what to do. And we can't do this just by a pop in with our guidance counselors. So we had to do Wellness Wednesday. And then as I wrap up, just my little response is that now, as we return to normal, we had over 600 students fill out a survey saying, please do not get rid of Wellness Wednesdays. These are teenagers who are usually very parsimonious with their words in surveys. I love all my students, but they tell me exactly what they feel, and the overwhelming just positivity. Don't let it go away. We have to keep some part of it. This changed my life, and all these things. That it was very, very emotional to hear. So we're still figuring out what that looks like, but Wellness Wednesdays in some form will be here to stay in our district.
Obviously you're trying to pull at every lever you have. And, Natasha, I just want to stick with you for a second too, as we continue to talk about what's happening here at home. You work with students at such an important time in their educational career, as well as some of their families. What have you noticed? What are some of the challenges that students of color in particular have faced as a result of the pandemic? How has the pandemic really impacted the mental health of some of the students that you're serving?
Yeah. This year absolutely rocked our students. We saw a lot of challenges that came up during the pandemic. Starting with just academic challenges, remote learning takes tremendous self-management skills, discipline, self-motivation. I've watched students who were A students last year, suddenly they're pulling in C's. And that's a big blow to their self-esteem and their confidence, facing, big gaps in their learning and big gaps in their grades. And really a lot of students are struggling to stay motivated, struggling to just kind of deal with this rapid transition to virtual learning, trying to get in touch with teachers for extra help, and just a lot of students getting fed up and really frustrated. Attending virtual school, alongside also dealing with your home life. I had students who were caregivers to grandparents or helping their parents take care of younger siblings. I had a student who had a newborn baby in the house that she was helping with at the same time going to school. And so juggling a lot of home responsibilities, in addition to affecting academic life, has a big impact on their sleep schedule, their energy for going to class, and just their overall motivation. So academic challenges were definitely some of the more immediate things that we saw. As well as just general social isolation, students becoming even more reclusive and withdrawn. Students who were, big social butterflies, and now they're home alone and really feeling unlike themselves, and are actually becoming more withdrawn and showing signs of depression, missing class because they don't want to get out of bed, and actually vocalizing that. So that was a huge struggle, dealing with some of my students with that, as well as just some of the general repercussions of the pandemic, which is dealing with loss and grief. Students having to bury family members, bury friends, and yet still expected to show up for school, show up for class, show up for Dorson, and still haven't really dealt with their feelings of grief with having to bury family members. And also having a lot of fear and anxiety of, their own parents, maybe, who are going back out to work. What's going to happen to them if they get sick? And so, it was a definite challenging year, and still is challenging, and not even just affecting their academics, but just kind of them overall as people. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's certainly been quite a bit for a lot of organizations like yours who have been trying to meet the needs of the students that they're serving, while also preserving their own staff and their own mental energy and challenges as well. So I think while we know the impact is disproportionate, there is a strange kind of unifying experience. But, Stephanie, I want to turn to you. Natasha kind of brought up this, this area of intersectionality, where we have, children and youth, college students of color. And then in addition, she added on to, here are students who have been academically high performers for a very, very long time and might be struggling with that as well. I'm hoping you can bring some of that into the conversation, specifically around some of your work around stigma. Can you share a little bit more about some of the stigma that students might face, particularly, maybe high performing students of color, and whether or not high achieving students of color face a greater stigma when trying to access the support that they need?
Well, I think a lot of these things kind of have to be broken down first. When it comes to stigma, there's the social piece, kind of what are my peers and my own perception of self as it relates to the things that I'm going through. And a lot of times when we do facilitations where we're talking to students about how to negate the stigmatizing things that may be happening, how people kind of socialize around what words they use to describe certain people, certain things, how they're feeling, saying okay is not an actual feeling word, right? We ask them to use what they actually know are words that relate to them and their immediate surroundings that help them relate better. The stigma that often happens is typically due to whatever is familiar around them the most, or whatever words or descriptions are used to either ignore honest feelings, pain, hurt, grief, or acknowledge them. And so that's something that when we engage in students, we want to know what language they're using to help themselves understand themselves and their peer groups, and articulate to adults in an accurate depiction of what actually is going on with them. I think it is important to remember that there's so many different layers to how people deal with stress. And in this situation of a pandemic where stress has pretty much been at the height of most of our lives, including our kids, that we're all experiencing it, and validating that students can experience stress is, from when I talk to students, something that they often hear adults say they're not supposed to experience because they're so young, right? Because what do you have to do that you're stressed, right? So I acknowledge that in this day and age, there's a lot to be stressed about. I mean, there's a lot just kind of societally. There's a lot of pressure to excel academically. There's a lot of pressure to become young and successful, whatever that definition of success is, at an earlier age. And so when you have a generation growing up on social media, on the internet, doing most of their communicating on devices and interacting in ways that can decrease the amount of face time they actually spend with each other, then that pressure can be heightened because there's no filter, there's nothing to kind of buffer the range and the intensity of how that is impacted. And then the other layer is what's just going on in your personal life. And so I think part of what happened in this pandemic is, we had people who already had diagnoses. Either a family member, a parent, or child had something already. Then we had, on top of that, people trying to deal with that on top of not being able to have escape from their home lives, from whatever, going to school for a lot of kids is an outlet. And so not being able to have that increased that internal stress a lot for not only kids, but their parents and whatever else that was going on in those environments. I think it is important to identify those kind of the people who kind of on the margins of the continuum of achievers. So when we identify someone as a high achiever, that identification, that label could be a stressor in and of itself, because those students are going to go towards that ideal, that perception. And when they can't, that is something that is internalized. And so how do we, one of the things that I had to do with my children, I have a 9 and a 10-year-old, was the expectations were based on what is happening right now. What are we going through right here, right now, day to day? Because now that gives them permission to adjust. And a lot of this model, a lot of what happened didn't leave enough room for people to really manage cognitively adjustment. How do we now, brace ourselves for this? How do we go from being in school every single day to now in home, getting up, flipping up a laptop or turning on an iPad, and that's our social interaction and our movement for the day? There was no real time and process that. So I think there's all of these different layers that are trying to be managed. And I think one of the good things that I heard from some high school students that I actually taught last semester was that this element of forced adjustment and adaptation also increased their independence. And so where parents had to juggle work and home life and caregive and all of these things, there were some students that kind of kicked up their own independence. And this is a good identifier for what we're looking for the future for these students coming back. When we see them kick in their own protective factors and their own coping mechanisms in order to help eliminate stress, like doing the dishes when they never did the dishes, taking out the trash when they never took the trash, going for a walk when they never went for a walk, doing things for family members that need help when those people may have been distant in another time, and maybe people ended up living together who normally didn't live together. So all of those things actually help buffer some of the negative effects of this, and I'm interested to see what that will look like, down the road. Another point I wanted to make when we talk about high achievers and people on that continuum is when we look at those students who are high achievers, they typically are those students who are either gifted, talented, either intellectually, creatively, or both. And I think sometimes the idea that they are so smart or they're good performers or high performers can get lost in what happens to them psychologically when they're managing so much that they're very good at producing, but what may not be happening for them is emoting. How are they actually dealing with the ups and the downs that come in through our lives? And I think this particular situation allows us to look at these dynamics a little differently, and assessing really how are we doing, post-pandemic, how will we do with looking at what stress does along a continuum, and how kids are able to identify their stress, articulate it, but also cope with it with means that they already have.
Yeah, that's incredibly helpful. And sorry, there's someone zooming past my window right now as we're all doing from working at home. But I really appreciate that conversation, and certainly particularly on some of the technology issues you brought up. I hope we can revisit. But I think just before we move to that portion, you're also talking about, or so far we've really just talked about things that are happening at the individual level, the individual student, the way that they might be identifying, or the layers of the layers that they're trying to navigate. But we also know that access to high quality mental health services, or the desire or ability, the stigmas that might be attached to access those services, can also exist at a structural communal level. And Dr. Bates, I was hoping you can kind of talk a little bit about this. The Dorson folks put together some really great background research on this for tonight. And, so some of the things they cite here is, Black communities are 20% more likely to report serious psychological distress when compared to white communities, yet seeking mental health care remains low. Oftentimes 1 out of 3 who struggle with mental health issues ever receive support for their services. So I'm hoping you can, Dr. Bates, bring us into kind of a community level conversation about the structural and the relational elements that may or may not help Black communities receive the kind of support that are duly needed.
Sure, I'll do my best. So first and foremost, I just want to say thank you for having me here with some absolutely amazing individuals. With regards to access to healthcare, so I think we have to look at a couple of different things. As Stephanie talked so eloquently about, I think we have to first look at the stigma that is associated with getting mental health care, and how for many people within Black and Brown communities, the idea of trying to access mental health care is something that, when you talk about mental illness, it seems to provide more of a stigma when it comes to the help that certain people need. One of the things that we try to do, particularly with BEAM and some of the programming that we do, is we really try hard to reframe some of the language around mental health. So oftentimes, you may read studies, or even listen to commercials on television, or even go into your doctor's office and you will hear the term mental illness. Even in my own practice, rarely do I use the term mental illness. I think oftentimes when people hear that word mental illness, how can you be well, or how can you be healthy if you are consistently looked at as being ill? And so one of the things that we do with regards to how we are talking to people about getting mental health services is how we're reframing the language, that just because you may have a quote unquote formal diagnosis, it does not necessarily mean that you are quote unquote mentally ill. We all have mental health, every single last one of us. And just because you're not completely mentally healthy does not necessarily mean that you are mentally ill, because even with the diagnosis, there are still certain things that you can do that will be able to help you to have optimal mental health and to function at your optimal best. The other piece too is, talking to individuals about normalizing, as Stephanie said, feelings and emotions. We are emotional beings. So we're going to feel happy. We're going to feel sad. We're going to feel angry. We're going to feel all kinds of different kinds of things. And so a part of it is, really kind of, one, giving people permission to have these emotions, okay, and helping people to learn how to identify what the emotions are, have the emotions, and also when you do that, it allows you to have more mental energy because you're giving that emotion permission to exist. So it frees up mental energy so that you can start thinking about, okay, what do I do in order to be able to try to cope with this a little bit better? So looking at emotions as something that we all have because we're emotional beings, and not stigmatizing people when we have certain emotions like anger. Looking at the terminology that we use. So if someone is having a bad day, oh girl, you bipolar, saying things like that can cause people to really have issues with their self-esteem, their self-worth, and just their overall self-concept, and may even prevent them from wanting to go get the help that they need. So part of it is reframing how we talk about mental health. And the other piece too is looking at and making sure that we are helping people to learn how to acknowledge emotions, identify those emotions so that they're not so foreign. Because a lot of times what happens is, as Stephanie said, sometimes we'll hear, yeah, I'm okay. And if you've ever gone into the grocery store and you go to the cashier and the cashier says, oh, did you find everything that you need today? Oh, how are you feeling today? And my favorite, I will admit, my favorite is, oh, I'm well, thank you. Thank you for asking. But well, good, okay, those are not emotions. I always say that those are qualifiers to emotions. But teaching individuals how to identify emotions. Sometimes I get, well, I feel okay. And so I'll follow up with that. Okay, well, when you feel okay, how do you feel emotionally typically? Oh, I usually feel happy. Okay, there you are. So sometimes it's about teaching people what an emotion is and that we all have those emotions so that it's not so foreign to them, so foreign for them to talk about them. And we can normalize that a little bit more.
That's really helpful. And we do have a couple of questions coming in. Stephanie, and you want to add something? It looks like Dr.
Yeah, I'd like to add that and go back to part of the question that you asked about access to care in different communities. I want to offer this. A good portion of my time was working at a local public hospital here in Atlanta, Georgia, where the majority of those individuals were underinsured. Majority of those individuals were African American. However, there was a gamut of different ethnicities at this particular hospital, and the majority of the mental health clientele that were seen in the psychiatric inpatient unit as well as the outpatient unit were African American. For me in Atlanta, that scenario looks very different from a lot of other cities. So I offer this information because when we talk about stigma, one of the stigmatizing things that I've noticed within the healthcare industry, or even when we have discussions like this, is that we continue to say that Black and Brown communities are not accessing or don't have as much access. And I think it really depends on where you are. Mm-hmm. Because a metropolitan city like Atlanta, most of the individuals who need and can access in a metropolitan area can access community behavioral health care. A lot of the neighboring communities here have community behavioral health agencies. But when you start talking about rural America, when you start talking about rural counties, when you start talking about places where they're more homogenous in the population, then we're looking at more microcosms of what this looks like in a behavioral health system. That makes a huge difference in whether or not people know that they can go get help. For the people here in Atlanta, this particular hospital is one of the most recommended places to go for mental health care, as well as overall health care, because it's connected to a huge hospital system. Those systems typically are better at providing behavioral health care when people need it from 18 and up than systems without a university connected to a hospital system or a hospital that is the main provider of all of the overall health care. So when we look at access to care, we should be looking at it or talking about it from a standpoint of what has my city or my county or my state provided in healthcare that behavioral healthcare is also attached to. We find when we do research, when we look at where people struggle to get access to care, they're not just struggling to get behavioral health care, they're struggling to get health care, period. And that may be in proximity to where they live. That may mean that there aren't enough professionals in the area of specialty that they can access. So like here, we have numerous psychologists, master's level clinicians, and psychiatrists, as well as others in the psychiatric and neurological fields for people to access. But when I lived in Iowa, there was one Black psychiatrist within the entire state. And then there's other parts of the country where, there may not be, the major cities may have mental health professionals, but the surrounding more rural areas may not. And it actually takes traveling in order to get that care. The other thing that I want to point out is that we are in now a Zoom society. Telehealth is here to stay. And telehealth is proven that when people access telehealth care, then they are more likely to be retained in psychiatric and psychological services. They're more likely to continue those services and continue follow-up appointments. And of course, then that means we're seeing better rates of care. Now what we have to do as a society is ask our cities and states and our locales about how does this now fit the model for youth? Yeah. Instead of us trying to send people into schools to provide this care, because there's so few for that many people who need it, then how can we use telehealth to best fit the needs of these people in this way? And honestly, that's an insurance healthcare question, because insurance providers can decide whether or not they're going to pay for telemedicine. So state level healthcare that most underinsured people will have access to for their healthcare needs, is that going to be something that's provided in their state health benefits? Yeah, so those are the real dynamics that are playing a role in whether or not people get care. And unfortunately, it's our system that we're working in that can determine whether or not people are actually accessing the care, being retained in that care, and if it's actually meeting the specialized needs that people have when they are going to get that care.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is part of the reason we have these conversations, because we are truly focused on that whole system. Dr. Peterson, I want to make sure that you get into this as well.
Yeah, I want to just touch on what my two colleagues had said. One was for Dr. Bates. You're absolutely right. When we look at, we call mental illness that negative way, it's really mental health, or that's why that the mindset and the growth mindset is a very positive thing. One of the challenges that we found, though, is that just when we had our students where we need to, or made some progress as far as self-identification, we still have many stigmas, and Ms. Johnson, to touch on your area as well, with parents and other people in the community. It's still unfortunately seen as something that, you don't share your problems, or you don't talk outside of the house. And a lot of that stuff, and we worked really hard on that. And in the beginning, that telemedicine that you were talking about, Ms. Johnson, or the telecounseling that we had with our staff was a little awkward. But you're right. Once you get into the groove of it, now you can break down these barriers. So we need to have more people of color as counselors all around. But now having access to on Zoom could definitely benefit that, because different kids have different problems and sometimes need to see different people when they're talking about those problems. And sometimes they want to see maybe themselves or a future, or whatever that is. So that's really super important. And then just one last thing that you made me think of is, I always tell parents, parents will sometimes say, I know my baby. And I say, well, yeah, you do. But there's another persona that we see that I see every single day, which is their public persona. And in many ways, that becomes their professional persona, right? Throughout the rest of their lives, that becomes their business or professional persona. You know, not everyone's going to be little baby sister, you know, in the workforce. You know, at home it's one thing. And I feel with our students, because we tried our best, but they were still robbed of a year and a half of high school time where they really solidify their identity. And in a lot of cases, and this is what I'm hearing from some of my students, was that really was difficult, especially with sexual identity, because they couldn't really do that at home in some places. And the place they could kind of fulfill some of those things or really just become involved in that was school, and it wasn't happening the same way. So we tried other things to have smaller groups to do that, to kind of at least just scratch that itch, but that was definitely a big need. So I just wanted to make sure, because you both said, all three of you said great things. I just wanted to just touch on that.
Yeah, I just want to kind of piggyback on what you were saying. So so with regards to, you know, our culture, many of us come from homes where, yeah, you keep your business at home, or you go and you talk to your pastor. But I think we also have to look at, you know, the history of medicine, specifically psychiatry, as it relates to racism in this country. And so when you talk about stigma, there is still a lot of stigma because of just the history that psychiatry has played within racism. You know, when you think about early on, psychiatrists saying that Blacks are immune to quote unquote mental illness, as long as it worked for society. If slaves were immune to mental illness, but then once slavery was abolished, then you're using that same system to justify incarcerating and keeping Black people in jail as a way to quote unquote protect the society. Okay, and then as just back in 1973, which was not that long ago, you know, when you think about even where we are now, the president of the American Psychological Association at that time, Henry Garrett, I think it was his name, basically said that he felt that a Black man's brain was less complex than a white man's brain. And so even when you look at diagnoses, because again, when we think about diagnoses, we think about the medical model. Even though we have the DSM, we still use the ICD-10 coding. But when you think about the medical model, oftentimes when it comes to diagnosing Black people and people of color, those individuals typically get diagnosed more severe than their white counterparts. I don't work with children anymore, but I used to work with children, and I used to do Social Security evaluations. And when I tell you that I would have children who would come in as young as 5, 6 years old, and looking through the paperwork that the school system sent along with everything else, and I'm seeing that this child at 5 or 6 years old has conduct disorder, a Black child having conduct disorder versus a little white child who's being given ADHD even at 5 or 6 years old. That's a whole nother conversation we need to have. But what most individuals don't understand is that when you give a diagnosis that punitive to a child, it not only follows them, but by the time they reach 18 years old and the court system looks back at their records and they see, oh, at 5 or 6, you had conduct disorder. Oh, you must have antisocial personality disorder. So we're going to lock you away in prison. And so that's how the school systems become a pipeline to the prison system. So when you're talking about stigma, one of the things that we have to understand is that because of this history and Black people understanding that if I go to this doctor and I tell this doctor my problems, they're going to take you away from me. And so people are not willing to go through that. So
I think it's important. I think it's a good point that it speaks to what needs to change in our system and how we frame things and how we do what we do. I think that is an issue that psychiatry, psychology, all of our mental health programs and training programs need to do a big, huge overhaul. Really, I mean, we're dealing with, you know, assessments and instruments that were used and designed by people who didn't look like us and have been in widespread use for over 70 years. And a lot of those samples where those instruments were developed on were not of anybody but pure white samples. And that's what we're dealing with in the stigmatizing of what mental health is. I think the thing that is important is to also acknowledge that there are groups across this country that are acknowledging what mental health is, that it is important to pay attention to it, that more people are paying attention to it. And I think we're at a point now where we're experiencing kind of this mental health revolution where, due to the pandemic and this much stress that everybody has been under, now there is a broad awareness that this is important enough for us to pay attention to and talk more about and do better work, not only on the side of going into services, but the service providers ourselves, the academics, the researchers, the people who are responsible for creating the therapeutic models that are out there to be used. I think all of this is the system that we're using that will eventually also down the road show more change than I think we've ever seen in this country when it comes to the provision of mental health care, because the need is higher. More people are going towards mental health care, and we have to meet the need. And so from working in research to now nonprofit, what I'm seeing is that there's this high level need across the board, and children will need, I think, we're going to see within the next year or so that the increased need in children across the board is going to speak to the level of professionals, the number of professionals that are going to come out, you know, from this pandemic, because right now we are not able to meet the need with a number of people that have these needs that have to be met. But I think this is telling that there will be more professionals of color that are going to be coming into our system. There will be more people who are from the LGBTQIA community that will become professionals, because the need has arisen. And now we're working with people who have an awareness. And I think what we have to do in that awareness is identify from those people, well, what are the needs that you have? What are the things that are more pressing than you than anything? And when I work with individuals, either whether I'm, you know, doing work or with coaching, my model is the hierarchy of needs.
Yeah.
We are motivated most by what our physiological and our psychological needs are. And when those things are not getting met, or there's injury in those things, then we're going to meet those however we need to. And if we can help people understand that meeting those needs, that mental health is one of those needs, then we can help people get further along in their process and in their journey of understanding better how to meet those needs and where to go to get that help when they need it.
Ms. Johnson, to your point, you know, I'm interviewing for some guidance counselors, and they kind of fall into two categories, broad categories. Those who counselor touched his or her life and inspired him or her, and those who did not get that support and wanted to make sure that that does not happen to another child.
Absolutely.
And I think, and I think one of the things that we did was just communicate with the parents, even if some of our parents are very young. You know, the stuff that happens from the time they graduated high school to the time their kids are in high school, it's a totally different thing. You know, even for our young teachers who come in who are only, let's say, 22 years old, they say, well, I'm young, I can kind of relate to the kids. And I still say, don't, you know, slow your roll, just because you don't know what could happen in a couple of years. It happens very quick.
A lot can happen.
It happens very quick, but communicating to the parents and just letting them know, hey, these are things that we hear students going through, and some of them are like, wow, and they didn't understand that. So we kept around alive a lot of parent conversations, a lot of community conversations, just to keep that going so that it was out there, and that it just, so that people were aware. And once again, I think that kind of slowly starts to work on that trust factor too, that both of you were mentioning it, because there's nothing unless the sources that we provide the help for are going to be trusted too. And that, because you're not going to get anybody coming back or any kind of referrals unless we provide good, sound, trustworthy sources of help.
So I want to stick here with the systems conversation, because this has been a fantastic conversation. And obviously there are, as someone who works in cross-sector collaboration, there are a lot of stakeholders involved in what you're talking about. We've talked about things related to the private healthcare system, related to government funding, related to individual action, communities and schools, et cetera. And I want to bring it back to our own Essex County here. And I would love to get the perspective of both Natasha and Dr. Peterson on this. As we are looking at coming out of the pandemic and getting ready to welcome more students back into either in school or on campus, is the system in Essex County working together? Are these multiple stakeholders, the private providers, the schools, the colleges, the community organizations, the faith-based sector, are we working together really well? And if so, are there some gleaming lights, or are there areas for us to double down in? And either Dr. Peterson and Natasha would love to hear from you.
Yeah,
would like to go first?
Sure, I'll speak first. So, I'm not a mental health professional. Dorson, we're a small organization. We don't have mental health practitioners on staff, but what we do have is a team of dedicated volunteers and advisors and mentors who serve as a support, an added support team and network for our students, and essentially extra bodies of people who can be touch points for students who we don't want to get lost in the system or lost in the mix. A lot of our students attend large public schools, many of which have large, student to counselor ratios. Counselors are inundated with students seeking out counseling. And as I see my role at Dorson and what our role was during the pandemic was, we as an organization need to just self-educate how to understand how to identify and monitor our students' mental health and wellness, and be able to just provide a space for them to connect with other students, air out their grievances, talk with someone who maybe isn't their school counselor, who they might not feel comfortable with, and really just have a space for them. So, at Dorson, we don't see our work as trying to replace what the school system is doing. It's really there to supplement. And so at this time where, as Stephanie said, everyone is seeking out counseling, students more than ever are trying to get help, and counselors are seeing students that they've never seen before. Sometimes students are kind of lost as to who to turn to, but at Dorson, they might feel comfortable with their mentor. They might feel comfortable with their advisor that they've been working with. And oftentimes we have more touch points with them that a teacher might not have. So, a student is dealing with mental health issues or feels as if they're overwhelmed, need someone to talk to. That's not something they might bring up in their class, in the middle of their math class. But in Dorson, during our small group advising, they might feel comfortable. And so for us, it's really just kind of serving as another support, another avenue for students, but also for us at Dorson, making sure we're aware of what supports do exist at school. So students who need help beyond our capacity, because we aren't mental health practitioners, knowing who their counselor is, being able to refer them to the counselor, being able to talk to them about, this is what the counselor, this is their role in your school building. This is how you can, seek out, get help. In some cases, we can even reach out to the counselor ourselves. And so we are kind of like a middle ground in being able to just support students, providing a space for them, and providing, at least at Dorson, what we talk a lot about is just self-reflection. As Dr. Bates and Stephanie and Dr. Peterson said, being able to articulate what's going on with them, how they're feeling, not just taking a I'm okay, but for our advisors, it's really important for them to dig a little deeper. When you say okay, what does that mean? How are you feeling? Why are you feeling that way? And also doing it in a safe space with other students. Again, as I said, bringing that up in class, in the middle of math class, not so much, but bringing it up in a small group advising, which is what, Dorson provides, and maybe some other community organizations, kind of supplementary and mentorship. That's a space where they might feel comfortable to do so.
Yeah. In Essex, we're very fortunate. We're a county school district, so therefore, even though I draw from the entire county, a majority of our kids are from urban areas, and we have our county executive, Joseph DiVincenzo, who pretty much is if I need one phone call, it's done. I have a connection. For example, our parents, like parents around the entire country, after what happened with George Floyd, they were very concerned about, of course, nationally, but what is happening in Essex County. So we were fortunate. We had access to the Essex County prosecutor who came and spoke to our parents. We also had the director for the police academy in Essex County that does the police academy for all the towns in our county, to come and speak to our parents. You know, and I know that does not solve everything at all, but for our parents, they wanted to know what's happening right here with them as well. And that was great. And we also had, because this is another part of mental health, right? A lot of our kids a lot of the things that are happening, then to have all this stuff that's coming to a head now. And one of the comments is, what do we see coming back? I see, and I'm expecting, and I'm going to encourage my kids to come back as social justice warriors. And I'm expecting them to come and question our curriculum, question these things. And in fact, we started a superintendent's council on race and equity. And one of our community, I have an inside because one of our schools is named after the late Congressman Payne, and his brother Bill Payne, who brought the Amistad legislation and a former assemblyman to New Jersey. He is, I call him my unofficial assistant principal. So this gentleman has such great insight and talks such great things to our parents and our kids, and talks about the Newark uprisings, and from not just a historic perspective, a personal perspective. And when he talks about, you know, personal stories of Malcolm X, personal stories of Martin Luther King, I mean, that does more than any kind of textbook we could ever adopt. So that has helped out. And then the last thing we're doing is we're just partnering with all the other agencies to make, I tell our kids, be the best you could be. So we have this first year is our first cohort of kids who are graduating from one of our schools with a high school diploma and an associate's degree. That is free, that the parents did not pay for. We paid for through our own funding. And so they graduate. So now they're associates and they're going to some great places, Purdue, Notre Dame, and they're starting off as sophomores. And we have a partnership with NJIT. NJIT, the president said, we need to have more people, students of color in our schools. And we said, we have no problem. I could help you with that. So we partnered and piggybacked with Essex County College. So now we're starting a pipeline for engineering for our kids from Payne Tech into NJIT. And it goes on with Seton Hall as well. But not only that, we've also made sure that we helped out our kids. Our kids are graduating with CNA certificates, so they could work right away if they want. They could go back and get their medical degree right out of the gate. We have kids who are licensed by the state to do cosmetology. And if you didn't know, braiding now, you have to be certified in New Jersey. When many of us grew up, everybody was doing braiding, but now you got to be certified, at least in the state of New Jersey. So our kids are being certified for that. And also they're getting additional partnerships with all the different county organizations that they touch on for job placement. So, and I know that's a part of mental health, right? Because if you're doing stuff, it's that other side of it, right? That's going to keep the positivity going. So that's what we're working for. And we're just really super fortunate that we're just in the right place, and that we have everybody. All we get is, what can we do to help, and how can we do it? So we're in a great place, and we want to keep that going.
I just wanted to say, I really like the model that you're talking about, Dr. Peterson, because the one thing that we're talking about is mental health. And for me, you know, I think of mental health from my training and what I did and work as everything that helps keep us from, you know, when we are suffering from any type of psychological disorder, psychiatric disorder, right? So anything that's, you know, diagnosable and all of that, because that's where that continuum is, where we're talking about the actual process that the body is going through, right? Like the brain is doing some stuff, the mind is doing things, that kind of thing. But what you're speaking of is the psychological well-being piece, this overarching thing that when we are meeting needs, we're able to survive, we're able to manage stress, we're able to contribute to our own survival, contribute to our surroundings and our economy and all that, making ourselves productive citizens. That is the connectedness of humanity. That piece is what helps people really, like you said, stay in the positive place. And those are the things that I remember when my mother was coming up, they had those type of programs. And those are the things that lead to higher level of success down the road, when you're able to get these things that help you as an individual contribute. Whatever your gift, your talent, your skill, when you're able to do that younger and going through your later years in life already building skill, then you are able to contribute. And that is a huge piece of empowerment that speaks to overall psychological well-being, as well as keep someone healthy. Because when someone is able to contribute themselves and their skill and their talent and their time and effort, they're more likely to do things like keep themselves healthy, eat better foods, get the sleep that they need, although that's questionable and debatable, right? But doing things that help them stay in movement towards what they're already doing, right? When people don't have those things, and those are protective factors, when they get risk factors, and we see more crime, we see more drug use, more substance use, all those things, then that means that those connections to how one contributes to their own survival are missing. And when people are able to have those things at their excess, that is really what helps a lot of people get the care that they need, be more motivated, as well as excel internally, which is what kind of this means to students at their level. It's like, what am I doing all this for? If I'm going to school, what am I doing it for if I'm still going to meet a world that don't feel like I can contribute to? So as I said, I really like this model where you're speaking to your students and hearing from them what their needs are, letting them be the orchestrators of that, letting them lead, letting them guide, but also offering them programs where they can also put their talent, their gifts, their skills into what they see themselves doing, and come out with some real tangible ways to contribute to not only their communities, but their society. That's huge for mental health and for psychological well-being.
So we have got some great conversations going on and some great questions coming in from our audience, and we're getting near the point of our question and answer. So I'm going to take the moderator's privilege, because there is one area I want to circle back to. And this is for you, Dr. Bates, and Natasha as well. And Iris also asked this question coming in too. You know, working with a lot of community organizations, a lot of them want to do more than just give a family, a student, a person, a page of links, a phone number to call. You know, we talk all the time in the social sector about the warm handoff, but even that can feel, you know, tenuous, risky. Hey, I'm going to put in this phone call on behalf of a person who's using my community services. I hope someone on the other end picks up. I hope they follow through. So as you know, so Dr. Bates, Natasha, as you've worked with community organizations, what have you really seen work very, very well in terms of empowering them to be a liaison, a connector, but also have you seen any good examples of places that have gone a bit further than just being able to raise the awareness or just being able to make a good referral?
Yeah, so kind of going back to what Natasha was saying before with regards to community resources, I think one of the things that we're beginning to see more of is peer support models that are showing up, even at the university level, at the community level. And I think that by going that route, what it does is that when you're talking about getting people engaged, not only engaged, but getting them retained in mental health care, doing so from a standpoint of this is someone that the person knows. You know, you may not be able to give a person a number and say, hey, go call such and such. It doesn't really quite work that way. And sometimes when I used to do health services down in Statesboro, which is a rural area, it really didn't work that way. You couldn't just give a number and say, hey, go call this person, because the person who you're giving the number to, they don't know that person. And it might be better that you say, you know, you find out, who does that person trust? It might be their deacon at their church who can help get them engaged to go and speak to that person. It might be their godmother. It might be a teacher at their school. It may not even be the guidance counselor, because these days, with regards to how things are working in the school system, you no longer have one guidance counselor or two. Or when I was in middle school, we had 3 guidance counselors at my school, and I came from a small town, Selma, Alabama. But you don't see that now. Now you have one guidance counselor who is going to several different schools. And so one school may not necessarily see that guidance counselor for a couple of weeks. So being able to identify people that the child or the family has a rapport with, who can talk to them and encourage them and motivate them to be engaged in treatment, is going to be the way to go. I think the other piece too is when you're talking about not only providing resources, but getting children and their families engaged, you have to do so from going in as the person who is not the expert on their experience. You have to allow them to be the expert on their experience and let them feel comfortable enough to share with you what their experience is. And one way you can do that, or communities can do that, and community organizations, is start with listening. And not listening to rebut or listening to respond, but really listening to really get an understanding of their experience. And then from that standpoint, once you listen and you understand the experience, you have to affirm the experience. You may not necessarily be able to understand because you haven't lived that experience, but you can affirm that experience. And sometimes we get individuals who give some pushback with what it is to affirm. Well, I don't necessarily agree with that, or I don't know about that, but that's not what affirm means. Affirm means that you can accept the validity of what is true for that person, okay? I may not like tomatoes, but if Dr. Peterson, if you love tomatoes, I can affirm you in being able to get you some tomatoes and put it on your salad or whatever the case is. So we have to be able to listen for understanding, encourage community organizations to also affirm the experiences of the children and the families that they're working with. And on top of that, I think when it comes down, especially when giving resources, giving telephone numbers, 2 things. Thing number 1, partner with who it is that you're working with. Don't just give them the number. Sometimes it's, you know what, I will sit with you and we can make this phone call together. Or, you know what, I will go with you to this appointment. Oh, you don't feel comfortable with me going? Okay, well, let's call Deacon Thomas down at the church and see if he can go and when he can go. So partnering with them to be able to be empowered to take on these services. The other piece to that is sometimes when we get resources, we don't need to just hand them off to the people that we feel are in need. We need to take those resources and call those resources ourselves so that we can get assistance with regards to how we're helping other people, while also making sure that we're taking care of ourselves.
Natasha, would you add anything? I know Dr. Bates covered a lot of ground there, which is fantastic.
Yeah, I wanted to add, so you know, I've needed a lot of support during this time to figure out how best to support my students. So partnering is crucial, and just meeting with other leaders of other organizations, finding out what they're doing, what's working. I feel like there's been a collective energy during this time, so we can all kind of help each other supporting students. A colleague of mine, his name's John, at a program out in LA called the Campbell Scholars Program. At his program, what they're doing is really making it a mission of the program, really starting this year, for each of their students to have at least one positive experience with therapy or counseling before they go off to college, where counseling services are pretty much at your disposal, but you still have to seek it out. And I thought that was so powerful, particularly because at the K through 12 level, as educators, we have such influence over our students and influence in pushing them to seek out help and pushing them to reach out to counselors. And in some cases, yes, we can reach out to counselors, you know, ourselves on their behalf. But I thought that approach was so important, because if we don't really nurture this in our students before they go off to college, we then risk them go off into the world and dealing with struggles as a young adult and not even recognizing that campus counseling is even a thing or even a viable option to them. Even from my own personal experience, I'm someone who I could have benefited tremendously from counseling in college, but I never had.
And I'm sorry, Natasha. And if you are a full-time student, it's free. Your tuition pays for it.
Right, exactly. And a lot of students are going off to college without even knowing that that's even available to them, and without them even before getting to college having a positive experience with a counselor or a therapist. So I think that's just one thing I wanted to put out there, because that kind of struck me and something I would love to embed at Dorson as well. And then I did want to add to what Dr. Bates was saying about just the importance of listening and affirming. I think during this time, what students really needed more than anyone was someone to listen to them, and just how important just having a listening ear is. At Dorson, the pandemic hit, we kind of whipped together overnight this virtual small group advising program. Some of our board members each took on a few students and hosted these Zoom check-in meetings with them during the weeks that we didn't have class. And really it was just a space to listen and affirm exactly that, to really trigger deep, meaningful self-reflection in the students in cases where they're probably not doing that themselves. Asking them, why do you feel a certain way, helping them to identify their emotions. And I think that's just so important and crucial, and something that we have to continue thinking about moving forward, that we cannot continue to treat our students as just students, but really looking at the whole person and understanding that there are people behind the student. I can't really talk to my students about how did that math exam go, or where are you going to college? None of that makes sense if they themselves are not well. We can't even have those conversations until we really address them as people. And so that listening and affirming, I just wanted to double down on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we get to some of the audience Q&As, because we have some really good ones, Natasha, I want to stick with you. We've heard a lot today about some of the challenges and issues that, individuals are facing, communities and institutions, as well as some of the opportunities and great work being done. We know there's an awful lot more that can be done here locally. And obviously, just by looking at some of the great questions that we have coming in, which please continue to submit your questions, folks. There's a lot of people looking to get involved, roll up their sleeves and really, help out. So could you share some ways before we move into the audience Q&A session that people can get involved in some of your work today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, at Dorson, so as I was mentioning that advising program, we put together a small group advising program pairing our students with volunteer advisors, essentially people who want to have high touch involvement with an organization and really have direct contact with a student. And so we are definitely on the hunt for more advisors, particularly male advisors is really important. When we first kicked off the advising program, we only had one male advisor that really couldn't support all of the male students. And I really wanted to pair our young men with other young professional men. And so that's definitely an area, serving as an advisor if you do want to have a high touch kind of regular contact with students. And then at Dorson, we always, because a big part of our program and mission is exposure and giving our students exposure to different types of careers, exposures to professionals who share their racial identity. We throughout the year have tons of different events, networking events, mock interview nights, lots of different opportunities for people to just kind of volunteer their time, essentially. Volunteer their time, kind of show face, and just be there in support by being in presence with our students. So that's just a few ways at Dorson that people can get involved and help, as well as we're always, as a nonprofit, always looking for access to resources, partnerships. A lot of the work that we do depends on partnerships. And so if you work with a local, other community organization or an organization that provides mental health services, partnering with us so we can make sure our students get directed to the right resources. And as Dr. Bates said, not just kind of flicked over to someone, but really have a meaningful partnership and a meaningful handoff is also really important. So if you're looking to make a greater change than just on one student, but really something more systemic, then partnerships is crucial.
Yeah. And then also, I know we're talking about a really important issue today. And so we want to make sure that we provided some resources for folks who are either in need today or might know somebody who could benefit for some mental health services. We're populating some of those services there in the chat. Natasha, anything you want to add to that part of the conversation, or panelists generally once Natasha's complete here?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, everyone has their cause, whether it's climate change or medical research, whatever it is. For the attendees that are here today, if education, racial justice, mental health awareness is your cause, I definitely ask that you consider contributing either a donation of money, time, or resources to us at Dorson or to other organizations wherever you may live. The Lee Thompson Foundation with Stephanie Johnson is huge and also can use support, as well as Beam, where Dr. Bates represents. Outside of money, time, and resources, if you are someone who yourself is in need of immediate mental health services or resources, we have dropped some links below so you can check them out. But I think it is important that leaving this conversation that people feel empowered in a way of how can I get involved? How can I further this conversation? I really hope that people at least walked away feeling a little more empowered to continue self-educating. And really it's beyond just today. It's really just continuing the conversation with others and also finding organizations within your hometown, within your neighborhood that doesn't have to be Dorson, but can be similar in nature that you can get connected to and really serve through your donation of time, money, or resources.
That's great. So thank you. And please do check out, there's a lot of really fantastic resources there, as well as some links to our own panelists kind of work that has been really informative. I want to bring us to some audience question and answers. We're nearing the end of our time together and we have some very good ones. Some of these have been answered a little bit, but I do want to just reopen the door because it is such an important area. I think a lot of folks, as a layperson, as someone who's not a mental health caregiver, provider, or an expert from any way, there's there can be nervousness about trying to support somebody who they may know and need. We've heard already tonight, the importance of just listening, the importance of being an affirming presence, the importance of making that kind of warm handoff and figuring out who that individual trusts and trying to make sure that they're getting the support they need through that vehicle of trust. Are there other recommendations for a lay person who might be interested in supporting a student who's very clearly struggling? Anything else that we want to add before we leave there? Because there are a lot of individuals who are looking, I think, to make a change in another individual's life.
I think it's always important to ask permission for someone to help you. I think it's one thing for us to see something happening or kind of sense something, but I think especially with kids, it's very important to go in with trust and genuineness. And asking permission can just look like, is it okay for us to talk about something? It appears that something is going on. You're not quite yourself. Is it okay for us to have a conversation? At least for me to be aware of anyone else who could possibly be of use to you. The reason permission is so important is because there's all these different reasons that people will or won't communicate the depth of themselves and go that vulnerable. It is literally out of respect to them and their scenario, whatever they're living, to make sure that they are open for someone else to come in and that can be handled in a way that they have control over. Sometimes we see people who we know are going through something. We can see the signs, we can see it, and we kind of just move in and try doing things and not know really what's all behind the walls that are there. And what could happen is either someone may resist, someone may completely retract themselves, completely go, into further isolation, or, they actually will say, this is what's going on, and you're not actually prepared to meet them at the level of the need that they have. So it's always, I think, important to ask permission. I think going back to something else we were talking about, and Dr. Bates saying partnering and listening is very important. Language is very, very important when having conversations. I do a lot of engagement work with people around how to approach certain conversations, how to listen in a way that feels like you genuinely care. And sometimes that's just literally sitting there with your eyes and ears open, paying attention in order to make sure the person can trust you, and can feel that they are at the center of attention for a reason that is solely for them to have a trusted relationship start to build. I think it's also very important that when we think about groups that English is not their first language, that someone else who speaks that language is involved, because language is so important when someone is translating, that you just don't know how important a certain word might be to provide comfort, a certain dynamic of words, or certain colloquialism, or something that makes that person know, hey, I can. That the only way you know that is if you've been close to this population before, these people, or this ethnicity, this culture before. Those type of, I mean, and we have our own, as first language, as English as our first language, we have our own colloquialisms and dialects and slang words and terms that make us feel like, yeah, we can really connect with the person that we're talking to. And with students, it's always important to use the language they use amongst each other in order to really get at what they identify as the trusted individual, the trusted environment. And I also think it's important to kind of already have a bag of tools along with you, just in case you do get some information where somebody needs some help. And those links that have been provided in the chat are some very good links that are from national organizations that can provide some of those very things and tools, like checklists or guidelines or crisis plans or crisis ways to think through crisis, and even as far as statements you can say, things that to say and not to say when someone is dealing with various, emotional or psychological distressing things in their lives. I think those are some of the beginning steps that we can take to make sure that, when we want to help people, that they're allowing us in, and but they're still in control, but also being ready to seek, a personal recess that makes someone feel comfortable to even go down the road of seeking any type of help.
Yeah, it's helpful. Dr. Peterson.
I think it's a little harder, not impossible, to just go as just an outsider, just to go into a school saying, I want to help. For security reasons, things have changed a little bit. And I don't know if you have my email, but I would be more than willing to share my email with all of the participants if they need a little direction, because here's how it could work though. You can do a couple of different things. You could, first of all, you could send an email to the school leader saying, these are my skills. I could serve on an advisory board. I would be interested in being big brothers and big sisters if you have it, or I would like to donate to a scholarship fund, so that this way it's not just, I want to help, because as we all know, that's great. But sometimes, we want to make sure to expedite it. You say, I want to help, and here are the things that I can help with, which really helps out as far as from the school perspective, us, so we could really facilitate that a lot faster. Also, I think it's financial, as Ms. Scott had said, definitely financial donations as well. Do scholarships, do the Dorson Foundation, help out those ways, and you'll see your money. Even if you wanted to get together, if you were a small little alumni organization and there's 10 of you, you want to put together a little scholarship fund, you're going to be planting seeds that could go on forever and ever and ever. And you could see and stay in contact with those students and see what good you're doing throughout generations. And so those are a couple of things that I think that would be very helpful. Or you could even, if you could volunteer to speak about certain things. It's just that there's just a little bit more of a hurdle you have to jump over, or a hoop, only because in schools, and I'm talking about high schools, even more so in elementary, we're very protective of who we're letting in our buildings now. So going through an existing foundation, or working with one of us where we already have partnerships with like the Dorson Fund of Big Brothers or Big Sisters, that's a little bit easier to do. So it's the doors are not really as open as they used to be, but there's still ways to get in. And it's called email, and I'd be more than happy to share my email so we could craft it in such a way that those crazy superintendents like me would hear it better. And I will be more than happy to provide my assistance.
Mm-hmm. You know, and just sticking with you real quick, Dr. Peterson, there's clearly some teachers and community educators in the audience tonight that are wondering about some kind of specific strategies, particularly as students are coming back to in-person classes for the first time in a pretty long time in some cases. You know, how can educators and teachers in particular help students flip that switch from moving to one modality to the next?
So let's start with the conceptual framework. The wheels of education, as far as the schedule, the summer vacations, everything that is built around our entire nation has existed for over 250 years, came to a grinding halt. It had gone through wars. It had gone through all of these different things, all of the civil unrest in our country, everything. Nothing stopped it. They were still going to school every day. So we got to put that in perspective. Nothing stopped it except this came to a grinding halt. And however long the transition was for you as a teacher or you as a mom or you as a student to get from in-person to virtual, I don't know, I'm going to multiply it by 3. I don't know, making it up. It's going to be 3 times as hard getting back. And I think we need to put that in just in our head, because what we want to do is we don't want to, these are kids now who did not have to sit in their maybe sit in their chair the whole day. They could have had their computer up. They could have been in their pajamas. They could have been comfortable. They could have been a variety of different things. They could have been watching TV while there's Zooming going on. So we got to put this in perspective, because it's not going to be like we flip the switch back. It's, you know what? We're not flipping the switch back. There's a dimmer. And now we're going to have to start to dim the room back up. So what does that mean? I think really one of the things that we've learned is, do we need all this time? Because really it's called the Carnegie units, and we're really judging and giving kids credits by how long their butts are in the chairs for over 180 days or whatever it is. I think we need to rethink this and take a look at that and say, do we need that time? And what do we want to do? Do we want these kids? And let's face it, my father's a math teacher. He'll probably hate hearing this. Love geometry, love calculus, but the tool, you know, to help you out and become happy, healthy, and productive, probably more of the mental health things that we've been talking about are going to take you and get you those areas, instead of finding out this, you know, how to solve the, isosceles triangle, let's keep it real. Let's do that. What do we want to do? Do we want kids to be able to do theorems, or do we want them to be healthy? Let's do both. But I think we have to re-examine what we're doing with some of this time. And then also, I think there needs to be I think that what the kids have seen, they have been self-directed. A lot of them, in some cases, we have tried our best with our teachers, but in some cases, these kids were teaching themselves. There are some teachers around and I'm making just generalizations, these kids have been teaching themselves. So same thing from the sage on the stage, where you have the expert in front of the room telling them what they need to learn. I think we're going to have to make this a shift to where what the kids are bringing to the table, what problems do they have, how are they going to solve it? And the kids are smart. Like, if you tell a kid to come up with their own assignment, they're going to make it harder than you thought you could ever think of. If you tell them to grade themselves, they might even give themselves worse grades than you would have. Like, they're harder on themselves. And I think that in some cases, they're a little bit more vulnerable, but in other cases, they're much stronger than we give them credit for, much, much stronger. And I think that they're going to be looking to be active and be part of these solutions, because they're thinking different things now. And just like the rest of the job force is saying, do we need 5 days a week at work? Let's start thinking a little differently. So maybe the switch, get rid of the switch and think of the dimmer. I don't know if those were helpful, but
I think it's incredibly helpful. And, talking about competency-based education and math pathways development, I mean, like, we need to have many more community conversations about those concepts. That's incredibly helpful and right. And I personally love that. The switching from a switch to a dimmer. I think that's incredibly helpful. But here we are at time already. What a fast-paced time we've had together. As we wrap up today, I want to thank each of our panelists, Dr. Bates, Stephanie, Natasha, and Dr. Peterson. Thank you so much for joining us, sharing your insights, your expertise, and of course, your experience and thoughts with us. A big thanks to Eloise for her work behind the scenes, as always, just a fantastic person to work with, and the entire team at the Dorson Community Foundation for hosting today's event. Our biggest thanks goes to you, though, our attendee, for joining the conversation, being active, and it doesn't end today. There are many more of these coming up, and please do avail yourself of those ways to get a little bit more active and involved in making a change. We've closed these sessions in the past with a call to continue this work together, to really partner meaningfully. And while that call is still really relevant today, I want to leave you with a slightly different message. Caring for one another, whether they're friends, families, colleagues, or students, is the single most important thing we can do as humans. Our ability to collaborate is actually what makes us distinctly human. We're only as good as our community. And so when someone in that community is in need of help, it's really up to all of us to respond. So if you or someone you know are in need of support, do not hesitate to use the resource that we provided you today. When in doubt, email, call, text somebody at the school, your superintendent, your college, your church, your deacon, your community organization, Natasha, or even your work. Reach out, be productive, and help your community need. Thank you for being part of that effort to make our community a stronger, more vibrant, and healthier place. And with that, I just want to say again, thank you to each of our panelists. Thank you for joining us. And I hope you all have a lovely evening tonight.